My name's Richard Hainsworth. I'm Fin analyst on GitHub, and recently I've been honoured to join the Raku Steering Council. I had a couple of things I wanted to talk about. One is the new version of RakuDoc, and the other is a proposal about the documentation website. I was going to do something else, but then as I started to prepare it, it got so long and so tedious that I got bored of doing it. So I thought everybody listening would be bored too. So I decided to keep to things that were interesting. So why does it matter? Why is RakuDoc interesting as a language? Why change from version 1 to version 2? And then I've got an example of one of the of what's new, and then there's this proposal for the website. RakuDoc is more than just a means of documenting Raku programs, and I think that it actually could be much more useful even for all websites and not just programs. And I've been working with RakuDoc, or as it used to be called Pod 6, since I began to try and help change Pod to HTML. And I gave a presentation about my Podrender and collection modules last year, and subsequently the new documentation website is driven by collection. So I was updating RakuDoc, the documentation about RakuDoc, and I found all sorts of things that were in the original specification that weren't in the new one. So that's why I began to work with RakuDoc. I have written websites for myself and for others, and I used a website, a CMS called a content management system called Grav, which was at the time winning all sorts of awards. It's based on PHP, and all of the content is in Markdown. And I found that Markdown was so minimal that it was very difficult to do anything with a complex structure, a document that was a complex structure. Markdown is minimalist by design. It was never intended to be used for complex documents, and since many programming languages the websites such as in WordPress have found the need to extend Markdown, there are all sorts of different extensions. So here are two sort of snippets. One is in Markdown, which I used for my website using Grav CMS, and the same content in RakuDoc. So you'll see that in Markdown, there are actually three different syntaxes here. One is to show a heading. One is to show that there's going to be a graphic or a link. So if this was going to be a link, studios, then the exclamation mark would be missing. So I haven't used all of the different syntaxes in this example. On the other hand, in RakuDoc, each of these have got the same syntax form. Now, you will see that equals head1 is the abbreviated form, for is an extended form, and then there's another delimited form with begin and end, which is a third. But they are applied homogeneously to all blocks. So head1 is a pod 6 block. Graphic is actually a new block that we're introducing with version 2, RakuDoc version 2. And then leaflet map, because it's capitalized, there's got at least one capital letter in it. This is a custom block. So essentially a renderer to be compliant with RakuDoc for version 2 has to allow for customization in some way, but it's not specified how. And you will notice that within leaflet map, there are a lot of extra metadata such as latitude and longitude, zoom, height, ID, head level, width, and they're all included in the same form and will be the same for every block. If you notice on the markdown side, this is a shortcode. Now, shortcodes are included in WordPress and in Grav CMS. I don't know, since they're in WordPress, they're fairly you can see lots of them, but they're not a part of the original Markdown specification, and therefore you will see variations in how these shortcodes are used. And here, the custom blocks is just a standard RakuDoc block. So when we were writing, when we were looking at the RakuDoc version 2, first of all, we noticed that what had been implemented in Rakudo was more than what had been documented in language.pod. But there are, so the original specification is in a file called S26, which is one of the specifications documents that is still current in a sense, and hadn't been completely transformed, hadn't been completely transformed into the Rakudo, the RakuDoc, the pod 6 that was being used to write all of the documentation, the Raku documentation sources. So we wanted to bring into version 2 what was still useful in version 1, but to clarify it more. We didn't want to write a specification that would be too big. On the other hand, we wanted to have flexibility for customization. So we thought we got to a stage where everybody was agreed, and then recently there's been some extra requests on RakuDoc beta, so we'll have to work through that. But I think we're almost at the stage where there is a community consensus for the new Raku version 2. So, why change? Well, if you read the document pod, and pod tables in the documentation suite, you will see things like blocks such as equals head 1. You will also see in there, you'll see things like this ampersand straight line, which is attached to the declaration of a variable, or the declaration of a function, or the declaration of a class. And an IDE, such as comma IDE, will, if you hover over that variable, it will give you what is written in this line. Now that's quite useful, because even when you compile the class or the module and you only have the distributed compiled version, comma ID will still pick up the original documentation of that variable or of that function if the author included it in. However, when you want to use RakuDoc for making a book or a chapter or documenting your code, such as the RakuDoc documentation suite, you don't need the code parts of RakuDoc. You only need the text parts. And similarly, when you've got code interspersed with text, you sometimes don't need to worry about the way in which it's rendered. You just want to see that as a comment or treated by the RakuDoc program as comment. And therefore the ID can just simply color it. If it's doing syntax, highlighting it, syntax highlight it as a as commentary. So the first thing we did in version 2 was to make these two persona, or these two aspects of RakuDoc clear. So there is a code part and there is a text part. As I said before, version 1 was not completely implemented. So an example of that would be, for example, alias. Equals alias allows for some name, say terms and conditions, and you would put terms and conditions in, say, capitals. It doesn't need to be. You'd give it a name, and then you would give it a textual meaning. So you would write out the whole of the terms and conditions in RakuDoc after that. Then everywhere else in the text where you want terms and conditions to appear, you simply put a angle bracket, the name that you've just defined, angle bracket, and so you would have a terms and conditions, and so that would then be able to be simply copy pasted essentially everywhere throughout the document where you would want it to be. The reason why it hasn't been implemented is because you can go backwards as well. You can say, you can start putting a angle brackets terms and conditions, but only at the very end put your terms and conditions. But the way that the renderer works is only as a one pass system. So having forward references was never implemented. There were a couple of other things about version 1 that, because it was written 15-20 years ago, it was very important to know what the encoding of the file was, and therefore you'd have an encoding directive. We don't need that anymore because everything is Unicode. So some of the things that we have taken out no longer apply. So here are some previously undocumented things that were in RakuDoc version 1 but never implemented. The alias I've talked about, definitions for inline definitions, which work a bit like aliases, but slightly different. The other thing is that now with RakuAst, everything that is known by compile time can be included in an alias. That wasn't true before. So we can actually put more into an alias, into an A open brackets than we could before. What use that might be, I'm not quite sure, but it's possible. The other thing is that P is a placement. P was available for HTTPS and for file, meaning that wherever you had the file and the name, then the text that it was being pointed to by the URL would be sucked in and and put into the text of the Raku document. And this is also very, quite useful because you can have, for example, licenses. You don't want to copy paste the whole license, but you know where there is a link to that license, and you just put it in as a placement. But P had all sorts of different schemas. So, for example, ISDNs, man, so that's the manual, or info, where info. So you could actually put it in into your document. You could have something coming out. If you were able to if you were able to provide a URL, then it would take that URL and put it into the Raku document. One of the things that we're going to be using this a lot for will be RakuDoc schema, meaning that if you want to reference the documentation of a module, and you know the function, and you know what the name is of that, the header of that module. So, for example, you want to reference the module for JSON fast, and you want from JSON, and you know there's a from JSON heading, then you just put RakuDoc JSON fast to JSON, and that will then take you to the documentation site. Nested is actually a very useful piece of work. It just nests everything by for spaces, and it's just an easy way of setting out your text. Nested exists today with pod to HTML. It was never documented in the pod file. And then semantic blocks. Semantic blocks are at the moment treated as if they were just ordinary blocks, but they can be accessed from outside the file. So the idea here is that things like copyright, version, synopsis can be put into semantic blocks and then extracted from a RakuDoc file without having to parse the whole of the file. The other thing that's quite interesting is that you can hide it. So you can hide a semantic block. You can write it at the very beginning, so you can put the authors right at the beginning of your document, but then you can hide it from the renderer until you place it later on in the file. So you can have things written at one place and then be rendered in somewhere else, and then you can render them 2 or 3 times. And this is a whole block. This is not just an alias. So the new things, we've got graphics, and the inline version is G. We've got a section. Now, what is a section? You may have found when you're using search on the document site that there are composite files, and the composite files take names of functions and methods that are defined in different classes and put them into the same file. The question is how much. So if you've got a header and it says, for example, what was I think it was succeed. So the heading of succeed in the syntax for gather, not gather, but given, had a number of subheadings. And what we wanted is for all of the text from the header level 2 to the next header level 2 to come in, even though there were header 3 subsections. So a section is from one header level at to the next invocation of the same header level, and all of that would be in the same section. Sometimes you don't want that. Sometimes you want to be able to define what the section is without using the invocation, without using the heuristic. And I'll explain why that's needed later. We also obviously replaced pod with RakuDoc, and we've got this new inline marker called Delta, and Delta for developer notes. In the future, as we change the documents to reflect changes in the language, there is a competing problem. On one hand, you want to retain documentation about previous history, but you also want to be able to add, you want to be able to say that this no longer exists and something else can be used in its place. And so we've had these deprecated notes that have appeared. But it would be nice if, first of all, you could either hover over it and see everything that's there, or that you could somehow define at the top by some sort of option that you only want the latest version of Raku or RakuDo to be documented. And then you would only see what is current. You would never see any of the old ways of doing things. So there has to be a way to signal to the renderer and then to the browser that some things can be omitted, or some things, or signal to the user that there's something underneath the portion that you're pointing out. Another thing is an ID. So there is a very important part of RakuDoc is these metadata options. You can have a block, and you can then have metadata that you attach to the block, and those are then used by the renderer. I'll show you an example in a bit. But when you're writing a very long piece of documentation and you want to be able to refer to a header, you don't want to refer to the entire title of the header every time. So for example, if I'm writing something and I'm saying managing plugins system, or the pipeline for managing plugins as a header, I don't want to have to refer to that every time with the whole name, which is what I would have to do if I was using standard RakuDoc. I can now say simply plugins and put it in the ID, and then forward reference that every time I wanted to reference that particular heading. M is going to be for customizable markup. I've used customizable markup for putting icons in. So for example, font awesome icons, but I also want to be able to use it for PayPal. So the website that I developed for myself, I want to have PayPal links, and PayPal has a way of, you have tokens, you have authorization, and you have all sorts of information that you can insert into your website. And then when the person clicks on it, they get taken to the PayPal interface. Now, that is actually relatively easy to do now with RakuDoc. I haven't done it, I will do it. But that it would want to be as customizable markup. You wouldn't want that to be a whole block, you would just want a little button somewhere in the text. And then table. The table procedural syntax is what we have developed recently for tables, and I will show you that in a bit. Now there are problems for implementation. So it's planned that the RakuDoc version 2 will be rendered only after RakuAst has become fully available. And the reason for that is that RakuAst cuts the processing of RakuDoc documentation by about 4 to 6 times, because Rakudo used to compile the whole of the program, and it compiled it in a very bulky form, and so it would take a huge amount of time. It takes 15 minutes now to compile the whole of the Raku website, and Raku Ask doesn't compile. It skips the step that is used by Rakudo at the moment, and so all you will need is that you will get the Raku Ask statements. So we will be writing a new renderer to render from Raku Ask, rather than from the compiled pod. Some of the problems that I've had in implementing pod version 1 is, for example, the version 1 has this schema TOC. So PTOC would be able to place a table of content anywhere within the text. Normally you would have it at the beginning, but you could have it at the end. The problem is that TOC is never completely filled. It's not completely populated until the last header is passed, and therefore any placement of a table of contents infers a forward reference. And as I said before, forward references were not a part of the renderer design at the beginning. So the same problem goes for custom IDs and aliases. So they will all be put to the next renderer. So here's the example. This is about the procedural tables. Tables are really vital to any sort of documentation. You want to be able to compare and contrast things. You want to put them into nice columns. And there was a way of doing that in RakuDoc, so Raku tables, pod tables. But the pod tables are quite fragile, and you cannot put pod inside a table. So in other words, if you wanted to highlight some text inside of a table cell, you couldn't do it. And that was just not really acceptable. So we were beginning to look at how to make a more generic form of a table. And the first obvious thing that I came up with was something that was looking like a HTML table with rows and cells within the rows. And I also wanted to have some way of concatenating two cells in order to make, a cell that would go across two tables for two columns, for example, at the top. If you want a header and you want a general header, and then you want two parts to it. I came up with a syntax, and Damien Conway, who is the person who specified RakuDoc at the very beginning, and who got really involved in the respecification of version 2, he came up with an absolutely genius way of combining the HTML paradigm with the GTK paradigm. Now, the GTK one is a grid, so you have this virtual grid in your mind, and then on each section you put a widget. And the widget could then be a table, it could be a block, it could be anything. And you would have then a widget inside the table. But it was a bit cumbersome, and it certainly was difficult to describe. So he came up with a procedural definition of a table that actually I think looks very good and gives a very nice way of doing things. So you will see here 3 gray columns, and they would be in a RakuDoc file, one after the other. So I've split them for the purposes of the presentation, but actually they're stacked one on top of the other. and you will see that the first grey table is talking about the header, and it's defining the header in terms of the date, samples, and mean. And then within the samples, which spans 3 columns, you have sample 1, sample 2, sample 3. So you've got the ability to have something spanning 2 columns. You've got something, so date spans 2 rows, sample spans 3 columns. And then the next part to it is the data itself. And the data is done, first of all, mainly by row and then column by column. So you can see that the dates are listed as 2023, March, April, and June. Then it's for the next column over is the sample data, and then the next column over is the sample 2 data and sample 3 data. Notice how the headers were all specified by rows. In other words, the row header with sample 1, sample 2, sample 3 are all in cells, and they're defined by in a single row, column by column. So here we have a mixing of both the rows and the columns in a consistent way. The next one is, can you see that, or is that better? Hello? Is there anybody there?
Yes, we're here.
Okay. So you, I'm afraid, I think you may have had a black box on your screen before. So the means at the end are defined as a single column, and then finally we have the last row is defined as five pieces of data. There is the label, the 3 means for sample 1, sample 2, and sample 3, and then the mean of the means. And all of that is in one way of specifying this table. It means that you can then have you can generate tables automatically if you wanted to, and then have them rendered. However, let's go on. So that was the first part of my presentation, and it was about RakuDoc. And how much time have I got left? Quite a bit, so I think. Now I'm going to talk about the website proposal. First of all, I need to say that this is a proposal. It's not the plan for everyone, because RakuDoc.org involves many members of the Raku community, and the proposal is something that I am putting forward. I think it's a strong proposal, but it still needs to have consensus. So please don't treat this as, set in stone. It is simply what I think would be a good way of moving forward. The other thing to remember is that since the beginning of the year, since we changed the website design, we've actually split the content from the way in which the content is realized in the website. And so we can make all sorts of changes to the website without changing the content. And the content is being handled by lots and lots of people who are all putting a lot of effort into it. The website itself and the tooling for the website is being handled by a relatively small number of people And Will Kaleda, who's on at the moment, he's managing both projects together. So he is the person who is managing this all. Right. I spent 30 years in Russia as a translator, and I had to manage things in several languages. I moved to Hong Kong, where I did a website in Cantonese, and Cantonese is a form of Chinese that is written with an old script compared to Mandarin, which is another form of Chinese, which is written with a simplified script. And Taiwan, the language in Taiwan is Mandarin, but it's written with a traditional script, which is used in Hong Kong. So China has two very distinct forms of script, and they're not. You can map the old script onto the new script, but you can't map the new script onto the old script because there are simplifications that were made. And it's a bit like, in terms of language, between US English and British English. There are changes, there's some forms of grammar that change. They're fairly minor when it comes to English and American, but in Chinese they're quite distinct. So when we're talking about multilingual websites, what we need to bear in mind is that there is no one-to-one mapping from one language to another. Now, English is common to programming because where most of the significant development took place, which is in the US, there was a very significant amount of programming done in Russia, but it was always in Cyrillic, and therefore those developments were never shared internationally. There is a huge community of programmers in India now, and China is, obviously got so many people all working in Chinese, but everybody uses an English-based language. And as Elizabeth pointed out earlier, not everybody, particularly when they're young, has English as their mother tongue, or learns English as an auxiliary language at an early age. And therefore, many programmers who are working today come to English as an adult, and therefore they don't have the same facility in English and being able to understand the documentation as native language speakers do. So if we want Raku to become a truly international language, programming language, then its documentation should be accessible in as many languages as we can make it happen. Now, this would once have been an unbelievably difficult task, but now that there is automatic translation of many languages, then we can put as the first step in this process an automatic translation of the English into a supported language, and then have a process of volunteers in that language beginning to work through it and clarifying it and making it easier to understand in their native language. So my view is that having a multilingual documentation site will be beneficial to Raku and the Raku community, as well as being able to give to the generality of mankind a powerful programming language that can be taught in schools at a very elementary level, with the facility that we know that Raku has. So the idea here is that there would be a canonical language, which is English, and then with the caveat that if there is a difference, if there's an ambiguity between a different language version, the English one would be the one that would count. And then supportive pages in other languages. And then if there's a change to the canonical language, so for example, someone edits the documentation in English, then that has to be signaled in the supported languages. Now, there is something that people who are not multilingual don't realize, and that is that everybody tends to operate in one language as a default and then uses other languages when they need to. And depending on your fluency, you can switch to the other language for a period of time and use that as your default. But normally, so for me, although I speak Russian and read and write Russian quite well, I still prefer to take notes for myself in English. I'm learning Welsh, I can speak Welsh, but I still think in English. When I was in Russia, I would be thinking in Russian as well, but I would still need to write notes in English for myself. So the user interface language needs to be different from the language of the content. So you just don't translate everything, you have the two things separated. So you need to be able to translate everything. So for example, all of the tabs, all of the headings, all of the messages, the pop-ups, those would all be the interface language, and those would need to be defined separately. And then there would be a drop down, so where you would have your current content language would be the one that you would be looking at. So for example, you could be looking as a Taiwanese user, you would be looking at Mandarin, the Mandarin form of Chinese in traditional script that is used in Taiwan. And then if you wanted to see how the mainlanders were doing it, you could choose the simplified script, or you could choose to go to the English to see, if there is some ambiguity in the translation, or when there is an ambiguity, there's always going to be ambiguities. When there is an ambiguity, you can go to the English. Now, commonly at the moment, if you so the idea is that once you would choose the on-page language with a hanging button, and you would choose the interface language through a custom option. Now, adding a new language requires several things. First of all, the translation of the UI components and an initial translation of content by AI tools, or some volunteer would work at most of the pages. All of the translated AI translated pages would need to be marked as being in need of copy editing. So, when somebody new comes in and they see a new class that hasn't been edited, they could look at it, and if it was okay, they could mark it as being readable. Or if it's needs changing and the order needs changing or words need changing, they could make PRs to the translation that would then be translated. The other thing is that, as I said, language switching could be a drop down. Now, this is actually quite a common feature on many websites. If you go to websites that are multilingual, they will have some form at the top. You click on it, and it's either flags or some form, and you get switched to the other page. What I want to do is to make sure that if you're in the middle of a very long page and you change to another language, the browser will change to that section in the new page. I have never come across, it may exist, but I have never come across a multilingual site that does that. If you change from one language to the other, you change from one page to the translated page, and you're shoved at the top of the page again. The other thing is that So when we introduced the idea of section into RakuDoc version 2, this is what the granularity that will be needed. So I thought that the granularity would need to be at the paragraph level, but I was speaking to my son who works in IT in Japan for a multilingual company. He said, no, you want it at the section level because in Japan, in Japanese, the order in which you write your sentences when you're explaining a thought is different to the order in which English is explained. And therefore, you don't want to have the same. It's not just that the words don't map to each other, it's also the structure of explanation is different. So you would want to have a granularity of change at the section level, not at the paragraph level. Then the other thing is that he mentioned to me is that when he does the documentation in Japanese in his company, all of the URLs are in kanji. So you would have the name of the page as part of the URL, and that is supported under Unicode. The libraries exist for that, but he has never come across a documentation site where the URLs also are translated. And I don't see why we can't do that by using the ID metadata that I explained to you as being introduced into RakuDoc 2 as a way of putting the URLs into the language of the that we're going to be translating into. So, I was just sort of saying most of that here, that version 2 has a new ID metadata option. Version 2 has a section definition and a block. And the availability of the metadata that can be attached to blocks can make a multilingual site implementable in a way that is impossible in Markdown at the moment. And that is why I think that RakuDoc is so much more than just a documentation specification. It's a way of creating very rich documents that can then be realized in interesting ways on the web. And I think that is the end of the, yes, that's it. So this is just the thank you to the people who developed the theme that I have been using. And with that, I will stop the sharing and go back. I don't know how much time I've used.
I think you have like, actually, yeah, your time is over.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that was going to be quick. I did a presentation in August for the Core Developer Conference, and I said I would need 10 minutes, and the presentation took 3 hours. Mainly because of all of the questions. I did the presentation about what needed to be changed in RakuDoc version 1 to get rid of all of the things, and then a lot of pushback from developers who said, no, we want to keep that, But the conversation took 3 hours instead of 10 minutes. So yeah. I can see that Wendy was listening to me there. I'm sure he was joking about it this time. Yeah.
I was not joking. I was admiring you. So happy to see you again.
Yeah, I took a lot longer this time as well. So, any questions? It's no. This is a very big. It's a very big task. It's not going to happen at any time soon. But on the other hand, I think that this is a way we've been started to talk about how do we make Raku a lot more available to ordinary, to the IT world, to the world, because Raku has developed to an extent that it really is a remarkable language and very easy to use. but very few people know about it. If you speak about coding, they talk about Python. They don't talk about anything else. But Raku is much easier to understand than Python does. And I think another aspect of the internationalization, and it was a suggestion in August, and Liz has taken this idea and run away with it so fast I've not been able to keep track of making languages so the programming language itself will be in the language that people can talk about. And then what's interesting is that we can already take a language such as I did one in Welsh. We can translate the Welsh back into Raku, so that if somebody in China, in Chinese, using a Chinese internationalization of Raku, has a question and they want to put the text, they want to put the code in, they convert it into English, and then someone else across the world can look at the English code, which will be in Raku, and will be able to answer the question, well, possibly, and it can then, then we can go through a translation. So the whole of the developer community will be able to see each of the different versions in their own language.
That's the plan.
Yeah. Yeah, there are, Anton, there are languages that are available in for different languages. So, for example, there's an example there. I can't remember what it is. Someone has taken a subset of Python and translating that into different languages, but it still can't. You still only have a subset of Python, and you don't have actual Python. You can't write a code in a new language and then have it converted back into Python.
Yeah, this is obviously a much bigger task. With large language models, this can be done to a point, but I mentioned this before. Large language models, they hallucinate, so it's absolutely not clear when you actually get reliable results.
No, Vadim, you're not muted as far as I can see.
I thought I was unmuted, but
no, Anton, you're Anton. I can hear you. Vadim is asking if he's. Vadim, can you hear me? You're not muted. Okay. Sorry, and Anton, what did you say? I interrupted you.
No, let's Vadim, because I had something to what you said, but it's a little bit more general. So I would like Vadim to continue, because maybe he has something more topical to say or ask.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, because my only input, my only microphone is headsets. It's not a question, it's just a general note that that's all super fantastic. The only thing we must remember, it's boring stuff, but we need standards for documentation. Where it's located, how is it distributed, how user get access to it. Because, for example, I was asking this question on the problem issue, but not everybody, I think, read about it. If you have a documentation file separated from the module itself, like you have a RakuDoc for module.raku mod for actual code, module.rakudoc for the documentation, the RakuDoc is not distributed. And if you want your command line tool to get access to this file, you need to have the source. That's a problem. Another big issue about standards is you have a RakuDoc, it's great, but then there are a lot of renderers around and a lot of ways to accessing it. You have HTML, which you can access locally, you can access via website. You have Markdown, which can be accessed on GitHub, or it can be accessed locally, and so on, so on, so on, so on. Also, we don't have standards how to unify it, so that one RakuDoc gets translated into formats universally and accessible from everywhere. And somebody would need to take care of that. And apparently tools which are going to be implementing it, standard tools. Like when you get a newcomers and ask you to write documentation, the first question would be, how do I publish it? Very likely. How do I write it? How do I publish it? And so on and so on and so on. We have no answers to those questions, unfortunately. So another problem, if somebody would be fantastically available to create this tooling with standards. It's a huge task, no less than creating a new documentation language itself, but it's boring.
Yeah, agreed. However, I think that personally, what I want to try and do is to create a system. Many of the tasks are going to need a lot of volunteer help. So, for example, making sure that all of the supported languages are copy edited is going to depend on individuals. But I think you're right about the standardization. So, for the multilingual side of the documentation suite, that is not the documentation of modules, but of the suite, they would exist as parallel repos under the Raku, in the Raku GitHub directory system. As far as documentation of modules, there is something in the Meta 6, but it's not implemented. Anyway, perhaps I will finish there because we're getting behind.